Umoya light, Umoya bright. I'm so glad you guys had the patience to stay with us. Thank you so much. We're about to get into part two of the Sharpeville Day massacre. I apologize for the feedback, but I will mute my mic and allow Ndati Steve to continue. Thank you guys for being such a patient audience. And remember to like, share, and subscribe to the Moya podcast. Ndati Masilela, Steve Lebelo, I hand over to you.
Okay, I think the last time we were able to, you know, to come through, we had just talked about the fact that Nyakane Zulu actually led the march, and and I said, yeah, I appreciate the insight, but that there were other people that Sobukwe did actually get in touch with, and the two that are often mentioned, I said they were the Wesi brothers who were both employed at African Cables, but I do appreciate the insight that someone brought in. I think we went on for nearly 10 minutes unaware that there was no contact. So I'm going to be self-conscious that I'm actually repeating myself. But be that as it may, if that is where we ended, if we ended with about with who led the march, then I'm being, there's an interference. Can you hear me?
Perfectly. We can see you, we can
Oh,
hear
okay.
you.
Okay, there was a bit of an interference, but the point I was making here is that we have come to the point where the massacre itself happened. We are now talking about the immediate aftermath of the massacre. Now, the point that I made was that the massacre itself could be leveraged by both the ANC and the PAC, to be able to attract, a great deal of support and attention to themselves. But considering the background that I've just given and showing that the 1950s India complexity would have reflected the masses, being endeared more to the PAC than they were to the ANC. Now, going into the 1960s, uh, you know, we have to understand that the massacre is still registering in the minds of apartheid securocrats. Now, in 1961, probably as a reaction to the massacre in Sharpeville and Langa, Poto embarked on a number of operations between 1961 and 1962. Now, Poto was what would be deemed to be the PAC's armed formation, and they went on the rampage. They were attacking people who were actually law enforcement agents of the state. Many of their victims would have been policemen who were notorious in their enforcement of influx control regulations. And these policemen were actually being murdered. Now, it happened largely in Cape Town and surroundings, in Paarl, but Paarl also stands out, in terms of Poko activities. When one storekeeper actually, aggravated Poko operatives by treating their fellow members rather shabbily. So they attacked the guy who was an Indian, and they actually murdered him, a store owner. But again, most of Poko activities were directed at chiefs, in the Eastern Cape, particularly across the Transkei. Now, these chiefs were seen to be enforcing rules and regulations, that were restricting the people's access to land. Some of the regulations would have included, things like cattle culling and land being, restricted, or people's access to land actually being restricted. And these were new apartheid measures, starting from 1948, when the Nationalist Party begins to reorganize, the Bantu administration, particularly in what was the native reserves, now being referred to as Bantustans. And the act that did that was the 1951 Bantu Territorial Act of 1951. And it is this act that was really, you know, uh, leading to a great deal of discontent and rage, amongst people in the Transkei. So the Polka uprising of 64 and 65 was a response to that. But it is the ways in which Polka acted, that that was actually concerning because during the altercations, I mean, no less than half a dozen times they made attempts at Matanzima's life. In fact, they wanted to assassinate him. But in the process, one chief was actually, killed by Polka operatives. Again, I don't know, it looks like, yes, I'm repeating this, and maybe I said this when we were offline. But the other incident, that really led to Polka's total alienation, was an attack on a family and a family friend. Four members of a family and a family friend were having a picnic along the Mbashi River in Transkei. And Polka operatives simply decided, using the machetes, they decided to attack this family and the friend, and they murdered them for no more reason than that they were white. Uh, and that certainly, cast Polka in a very bad light, both in the media and also in political and social circles. People were a little uncomfortable about Polka. Now, one of the, you know, historical events associated again with the immediate aftermath of the Sharpeville massacre. Okay, one would be the establishment of MK, but the other would be the Rivonia trial itself, which takes place from November 63 up to June 64. Now, this actually came as a result of the capture of the MK High Command in Lilliesleaf. Lilliesleaf is in Rivonia, Johannesburg North. I know, that we haven't actually interrogated this issue here. Or if we have, we haven't interrogated the issue enough. It is the one indicator, of the angst alienation and probably by extension MK as well. Alienation during this period, from the masses. One would understand, if the MK High Command was captured, say, in Pingville, or say in Duncan Village in the Eastern Cape, or in Langa for that matter, in Cape Town. But just to show that, the kind of social circles that these people moved in alienated them from the masses. The High Command was actually captured in a wide northern Johannesburg suburb, Rivonia. Now, the second thing about this is who actually, yeah, Lily Sleep, yes, who actually, betrayed the MK High Command. It is unsurprising that it was a wide member of the, of the party. Which party? Probably the SACP, but he certainly moved in the circles, of the Congolese alliance, especially, the white section of it. And for those who do not know who this man was, his name is Gerard Ludi. Gerard is in Gerard. Ludi is Ludi. And he wrote a book. Then the man has the nerve to write a book which he titled The Communitization of the ANC. But he's the guy who, who blew the whistle on MK being in hiding at Lilliesleaf. Another little detail, and I know some people are going to be offended by this, is the fact that Govan Becky happened to have just arrived at Lilliesleaf when it was stormed. Unluckily for him, he was there and he was taken in as well. I'm saying unfortunate because reading his biography, one gets a sense that he wasn't so much, a part of this 18 type, you know, leadership, that was more connected and alienated from the masses. If anything, I mean, Govan was in fact a man of the masses. So, that's how it happened. But the issue here is that once the NK command was taken in, both the local media and global media descended on on the courts and really covered every little aspect of the trial. It actually became a media sensation, from November 1963 up to June 1964. But in that period, there were, you know, uh, adjacent trials that were going on in Grahamstown, in Port Elizabeth, even in Pretoria. And in Pretoria, quite interestingly, for those coming from the West Rand, it was Poco operatives who came from, Randfontein, Kagiso wasn't there, Randfontein and Manseville, uh, where the PAC also had a strong presence. The interesting thing is that again, there it was policemen, who were attacked and killed, and Poco operatives were also taken to trial for that. But here is something else that the Securocrats would have done, along with the justice system at the time. What they did was to present Poco trials not as political trials, but as criminal trials. So if you are looking for Poco trials, hoping to find them under political categorization, they are actually being seen as criminal trials. And that in itself tended to undermine, the political kind of content that the PAC would have had at the time. And this is, remember, we are not talking about now. We are talking about the context of the 50s, 60s, probably into the early 70s. Now, that is what was happening in the courts. There was a kind of romanticization of the Rivonia trial, giving it a kind of publicity that would establish, the ANC as the leading, liberation struggle formation. And of course, the ANC did adopt, that slogan. We are the sole liberation struggle formation of South Africa. And, it emanates from this kind of systematic attack on the PAC's credentials as a rival political formation. But as I said, it is the Sharpeville massacre, that in it creates the environment, that makes anyone coming from South Africa, to be looked at sympathetically. So if there is a kind of acceptance of the anger across the African continent, in Europe and in the US, it is the association with the Sharpeville massacre. Hence, I'm saying the ANC leveraged the Sharpeville massacre more effectively and meaningfully for themselves than the PAC did. If there is one thing that discredited the PAC, especially maybe not so much across the continent as in Europe and in the US, it would have been Poco activities. And, which is why I'm assuming that the PAC leadership at the time would have dealt with the Poco thing very, very carefully, because it certainly would have been quite damaging to them. The point that I had made earlier on is that there's been questions about why Sobukwe would have been the most tormented political prisoner, and people were trying to find explanations for that. The reality here is that the apartheid securocrats, in their delusional, kind of understanding of politics, simply linked Sobukwe to Poco. Whether there was actually an organizational link is something that is still, debated at this stage. But in 1972, Sobukwe did an interview with historian Gail Gerhardt. And in that, interview, he actually condemned Poco suggesting that, he would have nothing to do with it. But then there's the answer. If the apartheid securocrats and the justice system considered Sobukwe to be the face of Boko, it is for that reason, that they would have wanted to torment him if they could, but also obliterate his historical record if they could. And the latter they were able to do. They completely obliterated, his historical record. But not only that, they obliterated the historical record of Poko as well, which of course became, it's a matter that became quite surprising to a lot of South Africans when a couple of years ago, bodies were being exhumed from Kgosi Mampuru prison. And these were bodies of Poko operatives that were executed between 1963 and 1968. Now, different estimates have been given, of this, and some people suggest that it is over 100. But I would probably just, on a err on the conservative side and put it at nearly 80. And all these were executions. Now, the issue here is that compared to the Rivonia or compared to the other tradition, Ukongolos, or the Congress tradition, at the end of the Rivonia trial and at the end of the trials involving, that alliance, only two people, seem to have faced execution. One was Mine, who was a trade unionist, and another was a man called Long, I forgot the first name. And it seemed that it had to do with the bombing of the Johannesburg station, and they were both executed. But the attack on Porto and the attack on the PAC and the commitment to, undermine the PAC becomes quite apparent, not only, by its rival political parties, but also by the state and also by the entire liberal world in South Africa. The white left in South Africa, white liberals in South Africa would have worked hard enough, at this project. Now, we've just stopped at 1968, 69 inside the country when operatives of Porto were actually executed. Earlier, I had said, the first 15 years of the exiled mission, both of the ANC and the PAC, is a matter that can be discussed in a different kind of, platform format, and not so much related to, to Sharpeville. What I want to focus on now is what happens in 1969 and the Morogoro Conference. Now, Chris Hani has explained in a number of videos, what led to the Morogoro Conference. And pretty much it had to do with the fact that the ANC was failing to register itself, inside the country, and that increasingly it was being forgotten. And that was quite concerning. But the second issue here was about, the tactics that were being adopted. Strategy and tactics became the theme, of the Morogoro Conference. And at the end of the conference, there was an appreciation for, a return to the masses. And that's how it was actually framed, a turn to the masses. And, I remember that it is, two white academics who attended the conference who actually, were pushing the idea of finding mechanisms of establishing an internal presence. One of these was Martin Legasik. Martin Legasik, I have his book here, Towards a Socialist Democracy. He was actually one of the, thinkers around the ANC at the time, and was concerned about establishing the ANC back inside the country. But the other resolution taken at Morogoro was opening up membership of the ANC to non-Africans, and that became a thorny issue. And just when you thought all the Africanists have left the ANC, this matter exposed the fact that there were still Africanists inside the ANC. And the objection came from people who were Africanists, inside the earlier on, I spoke about the article that I wrote in Saho that covers popular unrest between 1948 and 1960. I was highlighting here
Sorry, my
the South
elder.
African. Yeah,
Sorry to
yes.
disturb you. Can you bring the phone closer to you because your volume is not so high?
Oh, oh. Do I repeat anything?
No, you don't need to repeat. It was not comfortable to listen. We just need to hear you louder.
Oh, okay. Yes, earlier on I spoke about, Tennyson Makiwani, who organized the Alexander bus boycott. Uh, he was, he was in that meeting too. He was part of the Morogoro conference and was quite unhappy about opening up membership to other members. He was joined by 7 other members, and later they would be dubbed or labeled the Gang of Eight. Now, between 1970 and 1975, they were lobbying inside the ANC, raising a number of concerns about the direction that the ANC was taking. In fact, at some point, they arrived, at a point where they were referring to the ANC as the ANC of Oliver Tambo. But and these are the issues that these guys were raising in the letters that they wrote to, directed at OR Tambo and directed at ANC leadership. Now, the main issue here, according to them, was that decision-making processes inside the ANC had passed from African leaders to non-Africans. And the obvious reference here was actually Yusuf Dadu, Joslovo, and Ruth First. And it was an obvious reference to the three, and probably several others who were quite influential. The Simons, too, in Angola after 1975, would have been quite influential in the ANC at the time. So the Africanists were particularly concerned about the influence that these people had. And this was an ongoing thing between the Gang of Eight and what they presumed to have been responses from the ANC, until they realized that the tone of the responses was definitely not that of the ANC. That in fact it were members of the SACP who were responding to them. And they mocked that we want to be talking to the ANC and not to the SACP. By 1975, developments were such that this matter needed to be resolved. The ongoing tensions between OR Tambo and the Gang of Eight. And, it was in 1975 that a letter was written, and that letter was, informing the Gang of Eight of their dismissal from the ANC. Uh, and the letter was actually delivered by Dumano Okwe. Now, Dumano Okwe has always been in an unfortunate position of having to do these uncomfortable tasks, particularly in relation to the Africanists. In 1956, when the Soviet Union invaded Hungary, Africanists, before the formation of the PAC, Africans in the ANC complained bitterly about an attack on a nationalist kind of, of, of campaign that the Hungarians were putting up against Moscow, against the Kremlin. But the ANC being influenced and almost directed in terms of making choices in foreign policy matters, such as this was, decided to go with the SACP and wanted to endorse the invasion of Hungary. But they couldn't, because the Africanists were vociferous in 1956. So they abandoned the matter without making any further comments. But 13 years later, in 1969, again, Dumanokwe was called upon. This time it was the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. And the ANC wanted to endorse that invasion of Czechoslovakia. And the Africanists were saying no. And only 13 years later, the ANC insisted that they supported Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, 13 years after Hungary. And they then posthumously, if that's the right term, decided to endorse Soviet invasion of Hungary, which happened in 56, but was only endorsed in 69, along with that of Czechoslovakia. And then they went into the Morogoro Conference. Now that gives us a picture of who the Gang of Eight would have been and what kind and how formidable an opposition they were, to mainstream ANC. So in 1975, Dumanoko once again, delivered the letter of dismissal to Tennyson McEwan. They were dismissed as members of the ANC. And soon thereafter, they established their own ANC and they called it the African National Congress of Azania. But here is an issue here. It may well be that the expulsion of the Gang of Eight had to do with their nagging of the ANC leadership, over this relationship with the SACP. That may well have been the case, but there may also have been a matter of what was happening in South Africa internally. From 1968 to 1975, you're already beginning to have a kind of a mass mobilization beginning to happen around the Black consciousness movement. It erupts in 1973 in what becomes known as the Durban moment. This is when a Black consciousness aligned trade union, the Black Allied Workers Union, organized work stoppages in Durban. But this kind of labor action was short-lived, and in time it was crushed. And that's the same year that Steve Biko was banned, for the first time in 1973. So there was clearly a kind of a black radical, kind of movement taking shape. And if there was going to be a flood of young people coming out of South Africa shortly thereafter, they would be coming, having internalized this new dynamic. And if they found people like Tennyson and the Gang of Eight still around, that could be encouraged. And that's the sort of thing that the ANC did not want to see happening. So they expelled these 8 guys who decided to form the ANC of Azania. The ANC of Azania did not last for long. By 1978, it had actually petered out. But Tennyson McEwan still remained, a very strong voice, against the ENC. And in 1978, he took advantage of the United Nations Human Rights Commission conference that was hosted in Maseru, and he attended that conference. Now, Tennyson was also well connected within the United Nations Secretariat. He had worked, as within the Secretariat for the UN, and I said, this is the guy who who was the brainchild of the formation of the anti-apartheid movement. So, he decided, well, I'll get a job with the UN Secretariat, and he applied. They gave him a job, but later reneged. And it raises questions about, what happened between the time he was offered the job and when he was told he's no longer getting it. The long and the short of it is that Tennyson didn't get the job. And, he was getting, somewhat frustrated. It reminds me of a remark that one famous president made when some famous young person left the ENC, warning them that it is cold outside the ANC. So Tennyson was also warned that it is cold outside the ANC, so he couldn't get a job with the United Nations Secretariat. But he arrived in Lesotho in 1978, and he started talking about his, how disgruntled he was with, with OR. And it is at this point that he penned that piece, where he talked about OR Tambo's lifestyle. He said a lot of things, and some of which, unless they can be substantiated, shouldn't be mentioned. But, the one thing that he raised particular concern about, and which has actually been corroborated in different texts, by different people, was OR's lifestyle, and it was particularly concerning as to how he could have afforded, to fund such a lifestyle. But that became one of the big issues that Tennyson Makiwane actually raised. He also did raise issues about the deployment of cadres back into the country, which is an area that I would rather not talk about. But his condemnation of that too was quite telling. Uh, you know, that would be the climax. But then for the anticlimax, the beginning of the anticlimax, and while in Lesotho, attending this United Nations Human Rights Commission conference, he was making contact with diplomats from the Transkei. Now, the Transkei, this is 1978, has been independent for 3 years, since 1975. They were trying to establish themselves as diplomatically as an independent state. So such conferences as that of the United Nations, they would have taken a chance and sent some delegates. And Tennyson met with these delegates, and they had a discussion about the possibility of him returning to South Africa in 1978-79 and actually working for the Transkeian government. But that would have to be cleared with P.W. Botha. If Botha said yes, it could be done. So apparently, I'm not sure where Holomisa was. Holomisa might be called upon, to reflect on this and tell us how this whole thing was actually done. The long and the short of it is that Tennyson went back to the Transkei. I think it was early in 1979, on the understanding that he was going to become, a kind of a diplomat, an ambassador at large. Is, you know, if you like, he becomes a plenipotentiary. He speaks on behalf of the government without seeking prior clearance, from anyone. So he was that trusted in the Transkei and he could do the job. And that was in 1979. In 1980, while he was sleeping at home in the Transkei, an MK cadre was sent across from Mozambique into South Africa, from South Africa into Transkei, and assassinated Tennyson Makiwane, and then went back into the into South Africa and back to. That was quite, that was a performance. This is 1978 we are talking about. You move from Mozambique into South Africa undetected, from South Africa into Transkei undetected. That's fine. That can happen. But you assassinate Makiwane and then you come back. No. If you go through, we have to start asking questions. Knowing how tight the apartheid security net would have been. But that happened. And the guy went back to Mozambique. A couple of years ago, he passed away. And Paul Trewiller writes for a lot of articles for Daily Maverick. And Paul Trewiller was particularly concerned about this assassination of Tennyson Makiwane. And he wrote a piece in which he said, Tennyson Makiwane was the crown prince of the ANC. And if the ANC had decided to eliminate him, this has to be a decision taken at the highest level. But it doesn't matter perhaps to a lot of people because there had to be an explanation given as to why Makiwane was assassinated. And the answer was that because he was an apartheid spy. But I've given you Makiwane's background and be the judge. This was in 1980, when Makiwane was assassinated. Then the Soweto revolt breaks out. Earlier on, I know, I'm repeating this, but I know it seems to me that this was missed. 1975 is significant in very many ways. And one of these is that there was a coup in Portugal and the colonial governments of Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea-Bissau collapsed. And that gave the MPLA, Frelimo, an opportunity to move in, but they were opposed by UNITA and Renamo. Now, that also opened opportunities for MK to be able, for the first time, the geopolitical, obstruction of 1960 to 75 fell away. Now, MK and APLA could be able to launch cross-border attacks, from nearby, you know, Angola into Botswana into South Africa and from Mozambique into South Africa. So that would have heightened security concerns for apartheid securocrats. Uh, but at the same time, the ANC is quite aware that the movement that is beginning to take shape inside the country is actually inspired by the Black consciousness philosophy of Steve Biko, if you like. And thus, this is a Black radical movement. And if it is going to be generating a new kind of cohort of trainees and operatives and cadres, they would come into MK already with that kind of ideological orientation, but with the Gang of Eight still, inside the ANC, they may be a negative influence, and they decided then to expel the Gang of Eight in 1975. That could be the reason why they did that. But the ANC has struggled, since 1976 to really justify its presence inside the country and to substantiate it and probably to overstate and exaggerate it if possible, which they did. And the new theme that enters the liberation struggle narrative is the ANC underground. Now, the thing about underground is that when people make claims of having been underground, how do you respond to that? There's no way of verifying what they're saying actually happened or did not. And there's no point in asking because it happened underground. And back then, if you insisted you wanted to know, but what is it that you were doing? You were an apartheid spy. So, it ends the conversation there and then. So the ANC, pushed this ANC underground narrative, that it is the ANC that was responsible for what happens in 1976. But you have to find people that you can use, as anchors of the ANC inside the country at this time. And Joe Gabi appears to be the man in the middle. Joe Gabi has just returned from Robben Island the year before in 1974 after serving 10 years. In the same way as Jacob Zuma returned in 1974 after 10 years. And many others. John Nkadimeng, actually from here in Diepkloof, he also came back in 1974 after 10 years in prison. Another would be Neville Alexander, who at some point we really need to deal with, because Neville Alexander, also came out in 74 and would actually become, well, the first 5 years inactive, but in the 80s, and that's when there is a need for engagement with Neville and what he would have stood for. So 1976 happens, and it happens in the context in which the ANC is talking about this, this underground. And no doubt, this is substantiated by the capture and the trial of 13 MK cadres, who had infiltrated back into the country. And they include one of the famous, ones that you would know. Tokyo Sekwale was one of the 13. And over the years, we have known that, it's a cell, you call it a unit or a cell. This cell had a leader, and the leader was Naledi, not you Ntsiki, but Naledi Tsiki, not without an N. Naledi Tsiki was leader of the cell. Ntsiki, are we still here?
We are definitely still here. We're listening.
Okay. Yes, Naledi Tsiki was the leader of this cell, and Tokyo was one of the, of the 30. Now, during interrogation, as it normally happens, two of them fell away because there wasn't enough evidence. And if you want to look this trial up, it became known as the ANC 11 trial or the Pretoria 11 trial, because 11 of them went on trial. And during the trial, it came out that one of them was, in fact, a police informer. And let's not mention what his name is. He lives in Orlando West, and he did actually become, a kind of gave evidence in chief for the state, which led to the convictions of these people. Now, Tennyson McEwen, when he was talking about deployment, mentioned this as well in the most disparaging, terms, uh, and seeing it as merely a kind of an attempt to register a presence in a situation of absence, in the context of absence, meaning that you are justifying absence by pretending to be present. That's how he would have seen it. But then June 16 happens, and all that you have is contestations about who actually owns it. Which is why I'm thinking that if it is okay, maybe this would be the point to hold it. The idea would be, maybe if we need another installment. I think we've done Sharpeville quite extensively, and I think we've covered it as well as we could. I think the takeaway here for people should be that this is a new set of messages, that are being inscribed on the 69 bodies, and we are removing all the misconceptions about why this actually happened, and also about who organized it, and also about what the aftermath of it would have been. I think we have done quite well on that. So the next thing would be probably to look, if you will, I mean, we can take 5 years of 76 to 82 and probably have an extended discussion that would include Credo Mutua. I don't know if that would appeal to you. This is an attempt to construct a kind of a counter-orthodox, sort of narrative.
That definitely appeals to us.
Okay. So what do we do? Do we end it here?
No problem. I'm sure even you're exhausted because this is quite, you
Yeah.
gave us 2 hours.
I'd love to
So
know
can,
feedback. I mean, so that we improve this content the next time. Anything that you think was out of or needs to be worked on.
my elder, like I say to you, we don't get this kind of information. So we are in deep gratitude for you to take your time and your knowledge to share with us. We are definitely looking forward to the Credo Mutua installment. We can talk on WhatsApp on which day would suit you. But now we are ready to drink from your waters. Please don't be self-conscious. We are here to listen to you.
Okay, that's encouraging.
Yes, and we appreciate everything. People are even asking, is this recorded? So, which means people want to go sit down with this stream and go and unpack everything. So, we are so thankful. So, all that's left now is for me to say thank you to you. And then on
Okay.
WhatsApp, we arrange the next date that is suitable for you to give us the Credo
Okay.
Mutua installment.
Looking forward to that.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Thank you to everybody who joined in. Thank you for joining in part two. Part one is on the YouTube channel, guys. Oh, wait, there's a question, my elder. Barim, how did the apartheid state perceive and suppress Black consciousness compared to Marxist movements? Were they more lenient with the one than the other? I'm interested in this as to understand what they saw more as a threat. Was it Marxism or communism or Black consciousness? Just to end off, maybe you can just answer that.
Yes, Ntiki. That is one theme that we can deal with separately. But let me quickly answer this. When P.W. Botha comes to power in 1978, I don't know. Let me just explain this. I like the question. Was the apartheid state more, concerned about the Black radical paradigm of the BC movement, or was it the radicalism of the white left? And I think this is the way we need to characterize it. The Marxist-Leninist, whole thing is in fact a return of of the liberalism that Biko was dealing with in 1968. And when it resurfaces in the 1980s, as part of the UDF, because they actually become the think tank of the UDF. I know people have a different understanding, of, and some people would even want to argue that the UDF movement is a mere continuation of the BCM movement, and it is not. P.W. Botha becomes central in explaining that. When he comes up and says white supremacy and white civil society is facing a total onslaught from the ANC and MK, that is a figment of his imagination. It is either a figment of his imagination or P.W. Botha was being mischievous. And the latter is possible in Tiki because it worked for him. Uh, Botha would have known that by 1976, when C.L.T. Mashineni said the ANC is defunct and the PAC is dead, C.L.T. Mashineni was right. We can get and talk about that, but I know it will be contested by Eng people. But C.L.T.'s assessment of the Eng in October 1976 was correct, was spot on. And P.W. Botha knew this. But the concern here was if there was going to be the next uprising after 1976, it should never be inspired and be driven by a black radical paradigm. The regime that P.W. Botha institutes from 1978 right down to 1990, if you like, is an anti-black dispensation. This is what it is. It is institutionalized as well. The attack is not so much, because if you were to attack Eng's total onslaught in the 1980s, it is not inside the country, it is outside the country. What P.W. Botha did was to deal with any possibility of a black uprising inside the country. And what's the first casualty of that? The first casualty was, of course, Azapo itself. By 1982, Azapo is unable to rekindle the energies of the Black consciousness movement. And what's the reason for that? This is why I said at some point we need to bring in Neville Alexander, because this is the point at which the refashioning of the antagonism, or the rethinking of the antagonism in South Africa happened. So the answer to that question is that no, P.W. Botha's total strategy was aimed at the black radical tradition and not at the white left. And if you think about it, what are the outcomes of the white left? It is to bring about a socialist republic by attacking a capitalist system. It has proven that it hasn't worked. But what South Africa moved away from is racial antagonism in the 1980s. If it had happened, if the struggle was defined in the 1980s in ways that it was defined in the 1970s, Makis Kosana would have been white. She would not, the first nucleus victim would have been white and not a black woman.
Sure.
Am I?
Yes. Yes.
The death of Neil Agat threw black struggles into a complete disarray. He died for black people. Just in terms of the conversations that were going on at that time, Azapo was trying to establish the fact that it is counterproductive, to have white members in Azapo, which is pretty much what led to its decline. So Azapo, as a black radical formation, did not only have to put up with attacks from apartheid state securocrats, which it did, They did attack it whenever they could. But Azapo had to deal with a white left, South Africa's white left, Marxist Leninist. I'm not saying, the mass movement of the UDF was Marxist Leninist. It certainly wasn't. If it was anything, it was anti black, because that's what it was. But it was using the Marxist Leninist rhetoric, you know. I don't know if I
Yo,
answered that question. I hope I
yo,
have.
yo, yo. Okay, Ndade, you're going to tell us when you're available for our next political lecture. Thank you so much for giving your time and your wisdom
Okay.
and all your research. It is helping us a long way.
Okay.
Thank you guys
Thanks.
for joining in. I see there's quite a lot of you in the room. Thank you so much. Please, can you go look at these sessions are recorded. They're on the Moya podcast on YouTube in the live stream section. You can just go check out everything that we've done on the Sharpeville massacre. Thank you so much. Thank you again to our guests for taking the time to be with us. And this is where I end the live stream.
Okay, Mfike, it's been a pleasure.